the essence of flourishing and how that identifies with a subject and an object. The subject being the person, the self, its identity, and the object being something that is considered applicable to what the subject may desire, but also to a form of alienation presented by objectification, or a form of acknowledgement and recognition that one knows oneself to be an object of thought, and how that is posited by a subject in terms of how it might be something which is represented within the mind, within the notion that this is something of a flourishing. So the idea that we have here is, it's becoming quite convoluted already, but it sort of acknowledges the essence of the essential difference between this notion of logos, which emerged out of Socrates, the idea that speaking to people about what was considered relevant to them, what was on their minds, how they conceptualized linguistic terms such as justice, equality, and so forth. Justice and equality have found themselves contained within the word equanimity now. And equanimity is something that is part of the substance of the argument that something very egalitarian is part of how we perhaps idealistically perceive ourselves in the world. So we already see ourselves as equal members of society, regardless of our personal circumstances. Someone gets the idea that they are equal members of society, and thereto, and thereby and therewith, concern themselves with identifying certain principles of consciousness that have to do with how they project themselves onto others, or how others are projected upon them. In this sense, when someone feels this sense of equanimity is at odds with the other identity that is for some reason within the space that doesn't cohere with the rational being, it becomes part of the sphere of reality for that person, in a sense, and becomes part of this sense of an unflourishing, a non-flourishing, a deflourishment of, or destructive element in their lives that causes them to project their own inner sense of non-self-identification with the other. So it's a psychological notion that when someone feels that they're unable to identify themselves as this or that, or what, or whatever the consequences of their daily activities might be, they're unable to simply posit this pure notion of the I as, which is part of the German idealistic movement of the 18th and 19th century. And I combine 18th and 19th century in terms of the bond between them. So the idea that there was the flourishing would be part of this transition into the notion that the pure I would no longer be posited by individuals. Individuals would not be individuals, and it's concurrent with the thought of Arthur Schopenhauer, but we can of course readily admit that I again return to the psychoanalytic principles placed by Arthur Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Freud in the varying components of displacement of the idea that one posits a pure I, and an I that is, I am myself. We can see already that this is being sort of dismissed from possibility, in a sense, in the way someone might identify themselves. So in those under those conditions and in those terms, when one admits to wanting to self-represent and self-posit an idea that is the meaning for them, that what signifies, such that the way the signifier has for it, it's very grounded, signified in the subject, which is their own self-identification, that this would project something that was part of something quite actual, and there too it would cohere within all the representations that were floating into the realm of, or the space of representation of certain individuals that were considering themselves individuals, but that these would be sort of not necessarily intransigent sort of notions, or notions of insurgency or possibility, or something that was completely at variance with their own process of identifying themselves. There too, we get into the psychoanalytic principles that are not even elevated into consciousness as such, but are merely the experience of this sort of Humean impression. So one becomes very empirical in that sense, and acknowledges that reality is sort of, actuality is not something symbolic or not something aesthetic to most people. In consideration of technologies publicly available, the way their minds are operating is not in coherence with the way they identify themselves as subjects. So the process whereby one engages self-identification is already in conflict with another presence, and within their impression or representation of how the other has somehow superseded their own process of self-identification, while it is within a process of undulating beneath the surface, ready to come to a boil, sort of in this situation whereby someone is inhabited by ideas that are represented to them that they don't fully understand, and then when they go through the process of trying to posit their own identity, it has already been modulated in some way. So there's no way to affix self-identity to the principle that it is determined by the subject. And in this sense, the subject doesn't have the opportunity to determine it at any point in time, for material reality has already superseded the ontological domain, where this notion of, again, this flourishing and this joyous experience of a reality would be something extremely sort of framed in the idea of something universalistic and not quite relevant to certain subjects, but yet fully grounded in possibility and transcendent possibility, and that transcending that possibility of the existential flourishing, the ontological flourishing, would be part of this notion that is perhaps off course for many people, but this idea of a social totality or something total on the horizon that was not totalitarian, but was a totality that meant that things were being produced and represented as such, but that the filling of the space would not be involved with sort of noumenal considerations that were quite aggressive toward subjective self-identification, where it concerns the idea that their own identities would be bonded with something that involved the time frame, the space and time of their own subjective experience and their involvement with other persons in the immediate space of representation. Where too we acknowledge the possibility that one surpass a representation that had adhered or superseded the barriers of the possibility of transcendence towards something that was total on the horizon, that subjectivity was total and self-reproducing and self-producing. It would incur the possibility of potential psychological damage to a subject, which is not something we would wish for any subject that was engaged with the process of self-identification, that things were total and in that sense they were not subjective, but at the same time in the same sense that things, insofar as things are total, they are for the subject what identity is, and that it is becoming of the sense of a transmission of something that transforms their own self-identification. And upon this horizon, where something is being transmitted, one is most concerned with the idea that self-identity must have this sense of flourishing in its essential context, essentialized context of how it identifies with its purposive activity and social praxis. So the notion of social praxis is essentially the idea that when one posits what was formerly excused from the dialectic at hand as the positing of the pure I, would be considered positing of something that was elevated from the unconscious, for instance, and had to do more with identities that were being perhaps abstracted based upon someone's habitual behavior. The declaration that I am self and I will supersede all obstacles is not necessarily affiliated with the idea that when it comes down to the pursuit of an individual consciousness, that it would have for it its adequate representation to the other, that it would, the signifier would have the necessary content or form, and mostly content at the epistemological level for the other, that would establish the signified as something of content. So this relationship between content and form, always playing at odds between the signifier and the signified in psychoanalytic theory, and how these would eventually come to some sort of formal sense of recourse or discourse, public discourse oftentimes, that were allowing someone to self-identify in such a fashion so as to establish the personal identity formed not by the a priori notions that had been abstracted by the involvement with those forces that merely exist in the material realm.